Welcome everybody. We are here to do another deck video, this time Invasion. This is a deck that is fun to play, maybe not fun to play against, but I'm joined once again by Greg. I'm excited to go through this deck. I had this deck kind of built in a slightly different way, so we can talk about some of the ways that I built it and what you've done here with some virtual cards. So we're using virtual cards. This is going to be kind of a soft intro to some of them and how they can help enhance the game and make things a little bit more fun. But Greg, welcome back. What are we doing here with Invasion?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Yeah, let's do this. I agree. Invasion, I think, is a super fun deck to play. It may be less fun to play against, but you know that's on your opponent, not you. Okay, let's talk through this. So the objective is Invasion. This is an episode 1 objective from Thebe Palace. You know, the setup here is, you've got the Trade Federation, who's set up a perfectly legal blockade of Naboo. But of course, they eventually invade and send in wave after wave of battle droid to invade Naboo sites while the blockade flagship controls the system, right? So this is like, thematic. It's set up to mirror what's going on in the film here. And so taking a look at the objective, right, on the 0 side of the objective, it actually lets you get out quite a lot for an objective. That is, it lets you get out 2 sites, the Naboo system and the Naboo swamp, which generate 3 force for you. And I'll say something in a second about what it's generating for your opponent. Notice here, this Naboo system is actually a virtual card. You can use the original version. The nice thing about this virtual version that the PC made is that if you look at the dark side text here, if you control with a Trade Federation starship, that's what that symbol is, your force generation is +1 here. And so the PC has made this card to give a little extra force generation boost to Invasion, which is famously a deck that really, really struggles with force generation. It's a very force-hungry deck. So this is a really nice virtual version of Naboo that works really well with the objective. Then you have the blockade flagship, which starts at the Naboo system. So you don't have to pay for it. This just starts for free at the Naboo system. You've got a 6-power ship. The text to pay attention to here that I'll talk about in a little bit is that once per game, you can deploy a Neimoidian pilot aboard from reserve deck and then reshuffle. So you get to dig into your reserve deck, pull out a pilot and deploy it for regular use of the force right on the flagship. And then the other card that it starts is Droid Racks, which is an effect. It's really wonderful that it gets to start this because normally this costs 4 force to put out. And so being able to start it for free is huge. And basically what Droid Racks do is it allows you to recycle your droid. So when you lose a droid from a battle, rather than that droid going to the lost pile, you can put it on the Droid Racks for free. And then in your next control phase, you use 2 force to take it back into your hand. So your battle droids never die. They just get fixed, rebuilt, whatever it is, so you can keep sending more waves.
And you can have more than one on this at a time, right?
Correct. You can have, I think, infinite number of droids on this. You're not going to have that many droids. One of the nice things about this deck is you don't need a lot of droids because you can keep pulling them off the Droid Racks. But yeah, you can have more than one on it at a time, and you can pull off one at a time. So it's 2 force per droid that you pull off. So if you had 3 droids on it and you want to take them all off, it would be 6 force to get them back into your hand.
Got it.
Just a quick note, the PC did make a virtual version of Droid Racks focused on destroyer droids rather than the battle droids, right? So the battle droids are these guys on the right, your Roger Rogers. The destroyer droids are the crazy scary ones that are more concerning. So the PC built or made a Droid Racks that works with them, and there's a whole other build that just works with destroyer droids and other kinds of interrupts and effects that work with them. I'm not going to talk about those at all. I just wanted to flag for people that you have like 2 main options to go with in terms of how to build this deck with different kinds of droids.
Destroyer droids are, the one key difference there is the destroyer droids go into your use pile, not into your hand, so it's a little more annoying-ish.
Yes, that's right. And I think I take it part of the reasoning behind that move was that the destroyer droids are better cards generally.
Yeah.
They've got these built-in weapons. They make your opponent lose force when you use them. So it seems like a reasonably fair cost that they don't go directly back into your hand. But yes, yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so the 0 side of the objective, that's the things it pulls. That's some basics about it. A couple other things to keep note of. There are restrictions. There are thematic deployment restrictions in this deck. So once you have this objective out for the remainder of game, you can't deploy cards with ability except for Trade Federation starships and characters with Trade Federation in their lore. Right? So the idea is you can put out droids, you can put out Trade Federation starships, and only characters that have Trade Federation in their lore. And I'll say a little bit later about what that looks like. While this side up, during your deploy phase, you can deploy a Naboo site from reserve deck. So this is also what you're using to get your force generation going, Naboo sites. You've got the Naboo system. You've started with a swamp. You get, once per turn, you can pull out another site. Last important thing, or maybe two more important things, opponents' force icons at the Naboo system are canceled. Right, so if you look at the Naboo system here, it's got 2 light side icons. On the 0 side of the objective, those icons are canceled. Now, there's a couple things to think about with that. On the one hand, that gives your opponent less force to start with, which is good. Rather than giving them 3 force, you're actually only giving them 1 force. They can't deploy directly to Naboo because they have no icons. So the only way they can get to Naboo is deploying somewhere else and then moving over, unless they have a ship that lets them to deploy without icons. It also means you can't drain a Naboo because they have no icons. And it also means that it's not a battleground site, which is important to keep in mind as well for things that matter for whether you're at a battleground site. And the last thing is to flip. You need to control Thea Palace Throne Room with an Neimoidian and the Naboo system. You're already at the Naboo system. At least you control it to start. You need to get the throne room out, and you need to control it with an Neimoidian to get your flip. And so that's the 0 side of the deck. Once you get your flip, you're on the 7 side. There's like a bunch of fun things that happen here, which is first, you lose no more than 2 force to a force drain. This can be useful if you've got like your opponent's sitting at a 2/2 site and they've got a Jedi with a lightsaber or something like that. They would normally be draining for 3. This limits that drain to 2. There's a shield that does the same thing, but the 7 side of the objective does it. Your battle droids are deploy -1. That's nice as well. That saves you some force in a very force-hungry deck. When you have 2 presence droids, that little icon right there is a presence droid. And what it means to be a presence droid is, or any droid that has that icon, it means that that droid has presence, and so they can occupy a site, they can control a site, they can drain at a site, they can battle, they can be battled. So anytime you have 2 droids, presence droids of different card titles, or a presence droid and an Neimoidian in a battle, you draw 2 battle destiny if unable to otherwise. And that's not 2 extra battle destiny, that's 2 battle destiny if unable to otherwise. So if you already had a card adding a battle destiny, this wouldn't get you any extra, but it does mean that you get sort of guaranteed 2 battle destiny in each of your battles when you have this kind of package. Another big thing about this, by the way, is that if your opponent just drew an interrupt for battle destiny, once per battle, you can place that card out of play. This is really nice because kind of like mid-game, once you've flipped, most decks want to have a lot of high destiny interrupts in their deck to draw for battle destiny. And so the very cards that your opponent wants to be drawing for battle destiny are the ones that you're going to actually send out of play once you're flipped. So there's a lot of strong stuff on the 7 side. You flip back if the opponent controls Naboo system or the throne room. So you really need to maintain, you don't have to maintain control, but you need to maintain presence at those 2 sites or you flip back.
I think as far as starting packages for an objective, this is pretty generous. Like you compare it to like many other like special edition objectives, like this is very good. Really very
this
good.
Is quite good, and I think it's in part it's good because like otherwise battle droids are not that great, right? So you know, the boost, you know, you might think, oh, this package is so great, you know, this must be a tier 1 deck, but it's not, or I don't know, I'm not a judge of tiers, but yeah, it is a nice package to start with. One other quick note too. The virtual version of Naboo that I'm using, that I think everyone should use because the extra force generation, on the the opposite side, on the light side, it says if opponent controls, you are the opponent, because this is on the light side's side of the card, and incomplete control on table, that's the 7 side of the objective, your characters and vehicles are deployed +1 to Naboo sites. So basically, if you flip and you continue to control Naboo, then your opponent has to pay +1 to deploy all their characters to Naboo sites. So that's the basic objective, and I should note, while the 7 side of this objective is quite cool, there's a lot of fun stuff on it, it's not necessarily a deck that depends on flipping to win. Which is, say, like, it can win without flipping, and depending on certain kinds of matchups, it may explicitly not want to flip. While its goal is to flip, the idea is, like, this is not a deck that depends on flipping. You could actually do quite well without flipping, and I'll talk about that as we work through the strategy here.
All right, let's get into the actual strategy. I don't want to play this deck ever. Like, I don't want to play this deck ever.
So the main strategy, at least the main strategy of the version I play, which is sometimes called Invasion Blasters, is big destinies that focus on these 2 cards. Now, one of them is a virtual card. It's a B2 Battle Droid rather than your standard Battle Droid. It's a PC-made card. One thing that's really nice about this card, and the reason that most people use it, is that it can draw Destiny on its own. Pretty much every other Battle Droid only draws Destiny when in combination with other Battle Droids. This guy can draw Battle Destiny on his own, and attrition is +1. So this is like a really, really nice card. So this is the one that most people use in this deck. And then you have this Battle Droid Blaster Rifle, which, the weapon itself is okay. You deploy it on the Battle Droid. You have to pay a force to target, which is not great. You always want to be able to target for free. You pay a force to target. Target hit and forfeit -4 if Destiny +1. So you get a +1 to your draw. It doesn't make the character it hits forfeit 0, but it subtracts 4 from their forfeit. The big thing with this card is its Destiny number of 6. That's the really big thing here. And so the way this works is you've got these droids and you've got these guns. You've seen Droid Racks. I've shown you that. So remember, when you lose these droids, they're going to go to the Droid Rack and then back in your hand. Here's 2 other effects that are really nice. One is You'll Be Dead, which basically pings your opponent 1 force for every site you can, during the control phase, for every site you control, a battleground site you control, with a non-permanent weapon blaster. Right, so like non-permanent weapon, so not like Han with blaster or Leia with blaster. So it's got to be a non-permanent weapon, but it's got to be a blaster, which these are. It pings them a force. So if you've got 1 droid with 1 gun at 1 site, that's going to ping them 1. If you've got a couple droids spread out across multiple sites, that's going to ping them for as many sites as you control. It doesn't help you with the ping, at least, to have multiple guns at the same site. You might want to have that, but that's not going to add to the ping. So the ping is for the number of sites you control, not for the number of guns that are out. The other big card here is Inconsequential Losses. This effect from Death Star set, which basically makes it so that your weapons have a forfeit value. So if you, at the end of a battle, have to take some damage or have to lose something to attrition, your weapons have a forfeit value of 3 and get recycled back into your used pile. And so these 6 Destiny guns, when you lose them, not only do they forfeit for 3, which soaks up some damage, but they go back into your used pile and then recycle back into your deck. And then if you play like 10 of these guns and 3 of these droids, you are cycling not only your droids that you need to play with, but you are cycling lots of high Destiny weapons back into your deck here. And with 10 of them, you're almost always guaranteed to sort of have 1 or 2 in your hand. And as the game goes on, the probability that you're drawing them for Destiny is very high.
Is there a good way of pulling out these droids, or is there like a kind of a puller for it, or is it just sort of you need to draw them to your hand and not end up with 7 blaster rifles?
Yeah. What a good question, Matt. So there is an interrupt that allows you to pull these droids from your deck. It pulls any battle droids from your deck. So this is the interrupt on the left. There they are. It's a 5 Destiny used interrupt. And you can take a non-unique battle droid into hand from your reserve deck and then reshuffle. These B2s are non-unique, as are the rest or most of the battle droids. So this is a really nice card to get the battle droids into your hand. And Switch Off, I'm also just featuring now as like one of the key cards, because one, just looking before you even look at the text, it's a used interrupt with a 6 Destiny, which you can sort of imagine goes well in this deck. It also cancels an attempt by the opponent to target your droid to be stolen, hit, or lost. These days, you don't have to really worry about cards getting stolen, but this means that if someone is trying to swing a lightsaber at you or fire a gun at one of your droids, you can stop them from doing that. So there they are, pulls the droids, switch off, protects your droids. And again, you want a few of these, 3 or 4, I think, of these in your deck, so because you want to make sure you are pulling the interrupts to let you get the droids. You want to make sure you have the interrupts to protect the droids. And now if you just kind of look over this, you can see like this deck is filled with Destiny 5s, Destiny 6s that are all cycling back into your deck. You don't need quite as many droids because they're not going back in your deck. They're going to the Droid Racks and then right back into your hand, right? And so you've got these droids and you've got these high Destinies and they're all recycling and your opponent hates it.
That seems highly annoying because like, you're just drawing 5s, 6s. There's a shield. I think we'll get into the extra annoying part of making the 6s into 8s, but
yes, I'll talk about that in a second.
Yeah,
that's exactly right. And there's more. Just wait till I get to more of the annoying interrupts that you can use in this deck. Okay, so that's like the main package. That's like sort of the strategy. That's what you want to be thinking about. You know, recycling the droids, recycling the guns, high Destinies, and just like killing your opponent with big Destiny draws. Now, a quick note about starting effects. So, you know, I've already been talking about them, but I assume you're playing the starting interrupt, prepared defenses, so you have your starting effects. Now, Droid Racks doesn't count as a starting effect, so you still have 3 effects that you can choose. I've talked about Inconsequential Losses and You'll Be Dead. The other one that's a really nice one to use is a virtual card made by the PC. It's this combo card, begin landing your troops and fighters straight ahead. This is really nice. It has like a couple different things that are nice about it. Now, first, your unique Republic characters with ability less than 4 and Trade Federation starships are forfeit +2. So you've got a little forfeit boost. That's not going to affect a ton of characters, but extra forfeit is extra forfeit. Nabrin Leeds and El Hera are limited to owner's move phase and exterior sites only. Once per turn, you can deploy from your reserve deck an Episode 1 or Coruscant docking bay. This is really nice because, again, this deck struggles with Force Generation. This is an extra way to get sites out. I use this Coruscant docking bay from Special Edition. I like this because it's a 1/0 site, so it gets me 1 force and doesn't give my opponent any force. This is a once per turn thing, so you can have tons of docking bays in your deck and keep putting them out. But the rest of the docking bays are 1/1 sites, and so they're far less appealing to put out because these are sites your opponent can go to. You're giving your opponent more force. I just use this one. It's 1/0. It's a nice one. And then the last bit of text here is that while you occupy Naboo system with a Trade Federation starship, your force generation is +1 there. So this is another boost to your force generation, again, in a very, very force-hungry deck. So between this effect and the virtual version of the Naboo system, the PC has really done a nice job of like helping force generation in this deck where, you know, normally it would struggle deeply with that. Oh, the last thing, which is what you asked about, there is this really great effect that I used to use and that is quite powerful. And what it does, ignoring a bunch of the text, basically your blaster rifles, which is those 6 Destiny weapons that we use in this deck, are Destiny +2 when drawn for weapon or battle Destiny, which means that they're now 8s when drawn for weapon or battle Destiny, which is just insane because now you can suddenly hit Jedi, right? The weapons are already drawing at +1. You're drawing these as 8s. You know, these are crazy high battle Destinies. This is a great card. The reason I don't use it anymore is it has been shielded by the PC because, and I won't like get into the details, basically there was a very powerful deck. It wasn't Invasion that was using this mechanic to draw crazy high Destinies, and it was like dominating the meta for a short time. So the PC shielded it, and Invasion was unfortunately a casualty, an innocent casualty of that. If you're not playing with shields, you should 100% still use entire Legion of Unmatched Troops. And what you might want to do on any given game, depending on what starting effects you use, is you might have to choose between You'll Be Dead and Entire Legion. Do you want to start with that ping, or do you want to start with the +2 to the Destinies? And an easy way to do that is if you're playing against mains and Jedi, you need that extra +2 to Destiny. If you're not, you might start with the ping and pull the other one. But you might have room for all 3. It's kind of depending on how you decide to start things. But note, this is shielded. It's no longer a viable strategy, really.
which is probably okay. The 8s were a bit obnoxious, but
yeah, if you manage to draw two Battle Destiny in a battle and they were both 8s, which happens, you know, semi-frequently, that can be quite rough for the opponent.
In a previous version of this, instead of "You'll Be Dead" before the card came out, I have our Imperial Artillery, which is a very similar thing, and it's a nice 7 to sort of cycle in. So, but it looks
yeah,
like
so if you're not playing virtual cards, You'll Be Dead is a virtual card which blanks Imperial Artillery. You can't play, or it's a lost interrupt rather than use them. But Imperial Artillery is a nice used 7 interrupt that pings your opponent when you control with like a gun, or I can't remember, some weapon, not a lightsaber, I think. So if you're not playing virtual cards, you should look up that card. It's a nice one to use. Okay, quick note about force generation. So you start with Naboo, you start with the swamp. I talked about the Coruscant, docking bay. The other 2 main sites you kind of absolutely want to have in this deck is first the Theopal's throne room, because that's what you need to flip. It's a nice one if Nute or Gunray, if Haako or Gunray are there. It's a force drain +1. It's -1 to drain for your opponent unless Amidala is there, so it's a good site. The Theopal's generator is a nice 2/2 site. You know, you don't love giving up 2 force to your opponent, but draining them 2 is quite nice. And their force drain is -1, so they can only drain you 1 there. So this is a nice site to put out as well. This site is a bit iffy. I use this in my deck. I think most people don't use this. The reason most people don't use it is it's a 1/1 site. And because you can only pull 1 site a turn, it takes you like kind of at least 3 rounds to get this. I like this because you can deploy a battle droid here from your reserve deck. And it's a force drain -1 for your opponent, so they're draining you 0 at it. So I like it. Most people don't like it because of this 1/1 feature. Instead, most people use the Blockade Flagship Bridge, which is a 2/0 site, which is pullable with We Must Accelerate Our Plans, this card from Coruscant, which lets you use 3 force to take an effect into hand, which is a useful text as well, but it also allows you to deploy the Blockade Flagship Bridge. Most people will play 4 of these to make sure they get it early so they can get the Blockade Flagship Bridge out early. And so basically turn 1 or turn 2, you've already got your 2/0 site instead of having to wait, 3 turns or something like that for a 1/1 site. So most people are going to say that trade-off is not only a good trade-off, but like I'm stupid for not for not using it. I mentioned this last time with the My Kind of Scum video. I really don't like having to use so many deck slots for site pullers, and so like I just kind of manage without it. But this is certainly something you should think about. And the PC has made a virtual card that has a similar text that's even better for invasion. So you can still use 3 force to take an effect. It still deploys the Blockade Flagship Bridge. It's still a used interrupt at 5 Destiny. It also allows you to take up. That little up caret is take into hand from reserve deck, not deploy, a Nemoidian, right? So you get to take a Nemoidian out of your deck into your hand, which is what you need to flip. And so you can use 4 of these instead of 4 We Must Accelerates, and they're just better in every way. The reason the PC made this is not maybe just to help invasion. It's, by the way, just because I know we didn't talk about price of cards last time, but We Must Accelerate Our Plans is just a crazy expensive card these days because everyone uses it in every dark side deck, and you need 4 of them. And so even though it's just this kind of random Coruscant rare, it's $50, $60 or more for the card. You need $200 or $300 to get your 4 We Must Accelerate, which is a little wild.
Which is where virtual cards come in, and this is free, or this is
is where virtual cards come in, and this is free, and you can play with it live, right? So certainly on GAMP, you can play with the accelerates, but this in Invasion is just really lovely because of the Nemoidian pull. Okay, or sorry, you're about to say something.
No, go ahead. I'm excited to see what happens early game here.
Yeah, that's what we're doing. So early game, there's actually quite a lot of different ways to play this. You can play aggressively, you can play defensively, you can play kind of reactively. I'm just going to talk through like one kind of way of going about the early game, which is a bit more aggressive of a strategy, but I think it's a low risk strategy. But just know like there's a lot of different ways to do this, especially if you're not going for the flip or you're not sort of concerned about flipping quickly. You have a lot of options here. So you've got your setup that we talked about. You've got your effects, you've got the sites, you've got the Blockade Flagship Bridge. Remember that you're generating +2 force if you're using these 2 virtual cards. So now you're actually starting with 6 force rather than 4 force, and you're only giving your opponent 1, which is very nice. One thing you might want to do really early on, that is activate your force and then use there they are if you manage to pull one, is that not only it lets you get a battle droid out of your deck, which is very likely to be in there because you've got a few of them, but I mentioned this with our last video, anytime you can look in your reserve deck for the cards you need before you fail a search, you should do so. And since you're very likely to succeed in grabbing a battle droid, do this at the beginning and look for the other cards you might want to be looking for at the beginning of this turn. So use this, recycle it, grab your battle droid, use the objective to pull out the Theed Palace generator, and use the other starting effect to pull out the Coruscant docking bay, right? So now you're building your activation. And one move that I think is just a nice move to do turn one, assuming you have it, which you're very, you have your droid now for pulling it, put out the droid. You're very likely to have a gun because you've got like 10 of them in here. It'd be like really shocking if you don't have one at the beginning. And just throw a droid and a gun down at this site. Now, you might think like, oh, you're really exposed. It's only one character. Like what happens if light side comes down? Remember, this is turn one. It's true you just gave them an extra 2 force with this site, but your opponent is unlikely to be able to come down and make an overflow damage. Because remember, your battle droid forfeits for 4, the gun forfeits for 3. You have a lot of high destinies. Even though you haven't worked out some of the low destinies, you're likely to still draw a pretty good destiny. It's very, very unlikely that the light side can sort of kick you off this site right away. And even if they, it's very unlikely they can kick you off the site and overflow you. Kind of worst case, they'll kick you off the site. Best case, they just can't come down yet. And now turn 2, you've got a drain of 2 and a ping of 1 with You'll Be Dead. And so you're threatening 3 right away. And it's a really kind of, I think, low risk, high reward strategy just to start by putting this out right away.
Well, it's also nice because battle happens, the droid dies, he goes to the Droid Racks, and then the droid blast rifle goes to the use pile.
Exactly. So that's even more of why it's low risk, because all of this is recycling. You're not really risking losing them like you would in another deck. So I totally recommend just doing that. I mean, sometimes against certain decks, you might want to play more defensively, but I think this is like a nice strategy. The other thing to remember is this Blockade flagship had that really fun text that allows you to deploy a Neimoidian pilot aboard from reserve deck. A really, really great card to use here is Haako. Now, she adds 2 to power of anything she pilots. She deploys pretty cheaply. But here's what's really big about this. While aboard a battleship, whenever you have to lose force from a force drain at a system within 2 parsecs of Haako, you can use X force to reduce the loss by X. And so now Naboo is at parsec 5. What this means is that if you're a Naboo, if your opponent is at any system between parsec 3 and parsec 7 and they drain you there, you can use force to reduce that drain. If they drain you for 1, you use 1 force and you don't lose anything. If they drain you for 2, you can use 2 force, you don't lose anything. If they drain you for 2, you can use 1 force and reduce by 1 and then lose 1 force, right? So you can mix and match. You don't have to cover the whole drain, but basically she just mitigates drain for you from 3 to 7. Obviously, there are systems that aren't between that. Endor is 8, and Corellia is 1, and Kifix is 2. But there's a lot of systems between 3 and 7, including like Tatooine, which a lot of decks play, right? So Haako is just huge.
Okay, we'll get into like the matchups that this isn't favorable, but I think big space stuff, which this can help mitigate light side space a little bit.
Yeah. So this is not a particularly powerful deck in space. This really helps mitigate those drains. It's not going to help you in fights. And so I'll talk a bit later about like what to do. You really, this deck can sometimes do a lot of evasion with respect to battling in space, but this is a way to mitigate until you're kind of forced to battle. And that's like, to me, that's like a perfect turn 1. You get your Haako out, you get your battle droid and the rifle out. And I think this is like a really good way to start. Now, you've got this start. Let me talk about a couple battle tricks, because besides the already annoying stuff that we've talked about, this deck has a lot of really fun things that it can play that can protect your droids and that can make your opponent's life more difficult with respect to battling. So switch off, I already showed you. I just wanted to do that again. Remember, this protects your droids from being swung at. It's super important. By the way, there's like a kind of high risk, high reward strategy with switch off, which is you might let a swing go through and let your droid get hit, to try to tease out your opponent's sorry about the mess, because when they try to sorry about the mess your droid, you can use O switch off to prevent them from being lost, not just targeted for being hit. That's a risky strategy for a number of different reasons, but just like note, if you can, your opponent's got that sorry about the mess in their hand, this is a way to get that sorry mess out of their hand and into the lost pile. But just that's risky in some ways, so just be careful of that. Safer thing is just to stop them from swinging in the first place. Defensive Fire is super fun. It's a virtual card. It's under a lot of people's radar, but basically, if your opponent's initiated battle, you just get to immediately fire a non-lightsaber, non-permanent weapon for free, which is nice because the guns take 1 to fire for the droids, and at +2 to destiny, and that weapon can fire again. So if your opponent initiated battle, before they get to do anything, you can play this, you can fire your gun for free, you're drawing at +2, and then you can still fire again later. So this is just a super cool card. And what's really nice is if you don't have that O switch off and you were about to get hit with the lightsaber and then get clashed or sorry about the mess or something like that, this is going to happen before that. So it's a way to take out one of your opponent's characters before they have a chance to pull one of those tricks on you. Sneak Attack's a really fun virtual card as well. If your opponent just initiated battle, take a card from your hand and place it at the top of your reserve deck. You got an extra gun in your hand, 6 destiny, throw it right on the top of your reserve deck. You know exactly where you're going to draw. Wounded Warrior is this nice card from Endor that not only blanks Leia's game text, but if you just hit a character, they are now power 0 and can't apply their ability to drawing battle destiny. So if your opponent came down with like a big tough Jedi and you managed to hit him, he's now at 0 power and can't draw battle destiny if they're by themselves or like with a scrub or something like that. Super fun card. Close Call, virtual card, used cancels and redraws a just drawn destiny. That can be your opponent's destiny or yours. Or the lost text, just subtract 3 from a battle or weapon destiny. So this is super important for protecting your characters. Sniper and Dark Strike is a way to fire a gun during your control phase or during a battle, make a character lost that you just hit. Stunning Leader is a nice way to exclude characters from battle, to protect your characters from a battle when you're not ready. This deck can often struggle against mains, against Jedi, and that's thematic that your droids are getting wiped out by Jedi. And these interrupts can really help mitigate some of that threat. Although, watch out for sense. If an opponent's playing sense, they can potentially sense all of these, right?
Only half of these are really on my radar. I really like O switch off. I use it with Ghhhk a lot and agents. Like just anytime you people forget, or IG-88. There's a lot of like random Forlom, like random droids that are annoying. That O switch off is just a great
yeah, and it's this like Hoth card, right? It's been here forever, and it's great destiny used interrupt. So that one's fantastic. So these, there are others, but these are like the ones I use and ones that I think are just like, you get the idea. They're there to protect your droids, and they're there to like really mess with your opponent.
All right, what are we doing mid game? Package.
Yeah, before we get that, let me say a couple things about some of the other characters that you might want to have in this deck. So I've mentioned the Battle Droid. You want a few of them in your deck. You want a P-59 in your deck. I think that's a kind of auto include. He's this destroyer droid from Coruscant, draws battle destiny in his own, has an embedded weapon. If you hit, your opponent has to lose 2 force. P-59 is great. There's 2 of these I use. So I think most people who play Invasion don't really play any other battle droids than the B2s. I like these. I think they're fun. OWO is really fun because if he's with another battle droid, you get to draw 2 destiny if unable to otherwise. So it's like the 7 side of the objective, but you can use it before you flip the objective. So he's really good for that. He's got some costs. His deploy forfeit's not great. He can't really move very well, but he does have this nice text where drains at adjacent sites are -1. So if you can get him in between your opponent at 2 sites, your opponent is draining at -1 at both those sites. So let's say your opponent's at 3 sites, you come to the middle one, you knock him off that, and now you're mitigating drains around him. So he's fun, but yeah, he's heavy to bring out. Doesn't forfeit for a lot. This other droid I like because he subtracts 3 from the defensive value of a character, and without that effect, an entire legion, this is a nice way to be able to hit Jedi who otherwise much harder to hit. You can get them from defensive value 7 or 6 or whatever down to 3 or 4. So I use these. I think the reason most people don't use them is they're risky because they don't draw destiny on their own, and you need them together. And if you got two of them together and your opponent, sorry about the messes or clashes one, you're left with a droid that can't drop out of Destiny on their own. So I think that's the reason most people don't use them. But they have fun text. And if you want to be thematic and play with droids, there are like a million different droids that all have fun text from Theed Palace. They're scrubs, but they're fun scrubs. And if you really want to be thematic, dig around, look through the Theed set, and there's like a ton of these guys to play with. Okay, so that's for the droids. You need Nemoidians, right? Because you need a Nemoidian to flip. Rune and Nute are good ones because they add +1 to Force Drain at the throne room. They have some fun text as well. Rune, while he's with Battle with a Droid, he is power and defensive value +2. He also adds to attrition at same and related sites. Nute is fun. He adds a battle destiny if they're with a Republic character or a character of Trade Federation in lore. There's two different versions of Daultay you might want to use. One, if this one that you can see at the beginning of your draw phase, if you don't have any cards in your force pile, you can activate up to 2 force, which is nice. He also, if you drew Destroyer Droid or a Battle Droid for Destiny, you can take that one into hand and cancel or redraw that Destiny. So he gets those low Destiny characters out of the deck when you draw them, cancel them, and draw a better Destiny, hopefully. There's another one that's also nice, which he adds 3 to power of capital starships. He also makes your capital starship immune to attrition less than 5, so he might be a nice one to have in space to add more power and to give you a bit of immunity in space.
And we can talk about activate the droids a little later, but that's an interesting sort of also possible way to go, is the sort of activate the droids.
That's right. So activate the droids is an effect that lets you retreat.
Every time you initiate a battle, I think you activate 2 force or retrieve 1. So this deck is going to be battling a bunch. So you could just, it's a little engine to keep activating more or a little bit retrieval.
That was under my radar, but like, or off my radar, or whatever the proper term is. But yeah, so like that's a way to make an annoying deck even more annoying. Not only are you recycling, but you're also retrieving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, you know, it's thematic here. Okay, so those are your Nemoidians. I will say there's some other characters you can use. I don't use them, but there are some like very powerful cards that you can use that often people do. I like the kind of using some of these extra droid strategies, but there's also strategies that use other high power characters of Trade Federation in their lore. Your Darth Sidious from Theed Palace, a Lord Sidious virtual card, 2 versions of Count Dooku, your Lord Maul from Reflections 3, a couple of virtual versions of Darth Maul that have Trade Federation in their lore that are really nice. You've got your Admiral Trench and your General Grievous. These are all cards that a lot of people use. Trench is nice because if you've got him on the Blockade flagship, during a battle, you can send him to your use pile to make the whole ship immune to attrition. So that's like a fun one that I kind of goes in and out of my deck. And a quick note about these last two is that Trench is an admiral and Grievous is a general. And so they are pullable with Imperial Command. You can also use Imperial Command with them to limit destinies or add destinies, right? For Grievous, limiting or adding destinies on the ground, and for Trench, limiting and adding destinies in space. And so some people who use those 2 cards also will throw like 2 or 3 Imperial Commands in there. I don't use like this kind of package, but I think it's worth it for people to think about this because this can be quite powerful. Speaking of the space package, you know, the space package is not Invasion's strong suit. Most people play a pretty light space package. I play a bit of a stronger space package than most, but this deck will still struggle against really strong space decks. So you've got your Blockade flagship, you've got your Teihao. One card you should definitely be thinking about is the laser cannon battery. This is a weapon that goes on the flagship. It deploys on a capital starship. It can deploy as a react, which is really nice. You can use force to add to your destiny draw. So you can use up to 3 force to make your destiny draw up to +3. And the only thing to note is that when you're firing with this, you subtract 2 if you're targeting a starship with maneuver. So capital starships have armor, not maneuver. Starfighters have maneuver. So if you're targeting a capital starship, there's no subtraction. But if you're targeting a starfighter with maneuver, you subtract 2. But this potential +3 can be really huge. And when you hit, it also pings your opponent for a force. So this is like a great utility weapon. The thing that most people do at this point, by the way, is something I don't really like, but I should mention, which is that they'll take a droid, they'll take a gun, and they'll deploy it right on the ship as forfeit fodder. So the idea is the ship's not that strong, but you can forfeit the droid and the gun for 7 to soak up 7 attrition and 7 damage. And this is a way that a lot of people will sort of survive in space, is by like putting these droids on them with guns and then forfeiting them just as forfeit fodder. That's a fine strategy. It's a useful strategy. I don't love that strategy. Instead, what I do, and some other people do, is I use this. It's a DFS Squadron Starfighter and the Droid Starfighter Laser Cannon. Now, the fighter on its own doesn't look like much. It's 2 power. You might think there's not much going on here, but it's cheap to deploy. It deploys for 1, and it deploys for -1 to Naboo or to the same system as your battleship. So it's coming down for free. And the big thing is that you can deploy the cannon straight from the reserve deck onto it. So you deploy this DFS Squadron Starfighter, and then you dig in your reserve deck, and you can deploy this weapon immediately onto it, which, notice, is a weapon that can be used with Inconsequential Losses to recycle back into your use pile, into your deck, and can forfeit for 3, and it's got a destiny of 6. It's not a great weapon otherwise. It takes 2 force to fire. You don't really get much, you don't get a bonus when drawing. It's really that you can recycle it. It's another 6 destiny. And notice the DFS fighter itself is pullable with that same There They Are card, which pulls not only non-unique battle droids, but non-unique droid starfighters. So you can use the There They Are to pull the starfighter. You can use the starfighter to pull a weapon. The weapon recycles with Inconsequential Losses, and it's another weapon as well. So this is a really nice package that I like. And then I have 2 other cards that I think work really well with it, but a lot of people don't play these because they use up card slots. I like them. Flawless Marksmanship basically just adds to your destiny draws when firing a starship weapon. 2 used, 4 lost. So you can add 2 to your draw and it's a used interrupt, or you can add 4 to your draw and it's a lost interrupt. This can really help take down a high defensive value ship. And Relentless Pursuit is like a sniper or a Sorry About the Mess, but in space. If you just hit someone's starship during a battle, it goes lost. So these are 2 cards that I really like as well. This is my space package. You don't need this exact thing, but I think this is like a way to really surprise people with a much stronger space package than Invasion normally has. And it's worth mentioning that these 2 other interrupts that we already talked about also work in space. Sneak Attack works in space. Your opponent initiated battle, you take a high destiny card and you put on top of your reserve deck. Defensive Fire works in space. It just says they've initiated battle, fire a non-lightsaber, non-permanent weapon. So you can immediately fire that droid starfighter laser cannon, which normally takes 2 force to fire. It now fires for free and at +2. So don't forget that these cards work in space and it can be very powerful as well.
A small but efficient package.
Yes, that's the idea. And now we get to the mid game. So the mid game, there's kind of 2 different ways to think about this. You can, because I mentioned you can go for a kind of non-flip strategy or flip strategy, but basically drain in battle on the ground and evade in space. Flip is not that different, but let me say something about sort of draining, battling, evading, reacting. So remember, this is where we were at the end of round 1. Here's a strategy. You just kind of spread. You spread with your droids. You spread with your guns. This is huge. If you just look at this, you're draining 2 at the swamp. You're draining 2 at the generator. You're only draining 1 at the throne room, but you can put down the droid at one of your opponent's sites where you're draining them 2. You're draining them for 6, 5, or 6. You've got guns on 3 different sites. So if you're assuming you're controlling, right, you've got the You'll Be Dead. You're pinging them for another 3. So you're hitting your opponent for like 8 or 9 force a turn if they're not battling you. And if they are battling you, you're drawing these big destinies, you're wiping them out, and you're recycling your droids and your guns. And so like just spread, drain, ping, fight, right? You're playing your tricks, you're clearing sites, you're recycling, you're getting back your cards, you're drawing high destinies. And then don't forget that in space, you're mitigating space drains by, if your opponent is at other systems, you're just subtracting from those drains. So this is your kind of mid-game strategy.
So you don't really want to have 2 droids together for the flip bonus of 2 destiny. It's just not really necessary.
Well, it certainly helps. And there are, of course, reasons to flip. you can still have two droids together. Of course, if you have two of the same battle droid together, that's not going to help because the flip on the objective is two droids with different card titles, or a droid and an Imodian. So putting two battle droids together wouldn't really help with that. I mean, I'm just using this as an example. You might not, as the game gets it after the first few rounds, it's way too exposed to leave a droid potentially just by themselves, unless you've got like a Ghhhk in hand or something like that. So, I mean, think about the tricks you have in your hand. That should determine how much you want to back up these guys. Sometimes the right move is to kind of spread and not spread pretty thin. Otherwise, other times you might want to be on fewer sites and have a few characters at each site. It kind of depends on the kind of deck your opponent is playing, and if you're worried about a kind of huge beatdown or not, right? But this is like a perfectly good strategy. And if you're struggling to flip because you think you can't control the Naboo system because your opponent is going to be way too heavy in space, or you're not finding your Nemoidians, you can still do quite well engaging in this strategy. The only kind of thing to worry about here is I say, look, you're draining on the ground, you're blocking drains in space, right? But remember, on the 0 side of the objective, the light side force icons here are canceled at Naboo. And so this is not a battleground site. And the problem with it being not a battleground site is, assuming you're playing shields, your opponent is 100% going to throw the battle plane shield. That's forcing you to pay 3 force to drain at each site you drain. So if you're trying to drain at 3 sites, that's costing you 9 force to drain at those sites. If you're trying to cancel a few different drains in space, that's going to cost you 3 or 4 force, right? And so you're spending, 12, or, you're spending a lot of force every turn just to drain and just to cancel drains in space. And that leaves you no force to do anything whatsoever. You can't deploy anything. You can't replenish your hand. And so while this is like a nice strategy, in a certain sense, it's a very expensive strategy. It's not sustainable. Now, one thing you can do is you can move away from Naboo, right, to your opponent's battleground, assuming your opponent has a battleground, right? So that's like one thing you can do. So that is move away from Naboo, go to your opponent's battleground. Now you're on a battleground. Now you're at a battleground site in a battleground system, and so the shield doesn't affect you. You can drain for free. Now, the only thing, which is fine, the things to worry about there is, one, you're exposing your ship at a battleground site. Now they can deploy right to you. But also, more than that, you also lose the +2 to force generation from these 2 cards, which only work if you're at Naboo. Now, that might be a perfectly fine cost to pay, right? You lose that extra 2 force generation to not have to pay, 6 to 9 force to force drain. But just keep in mind that you move away from Naboo to get to a battleground, you lose a little force generation, and you're exposing yourself. So that's the kind of things to think about if you're not worrying about flipping. If you are worrying about, or if you're trying to flip, which again, flipping is really fun in this deck. It's not that you don't want to do it. You just want to think about whether it's like the best thing to do given the matchup. If you're flipping, what you need to be doing is holding down Naboo at all costs, right? The Naboo system and the throne room. And so, you throw down your Nute or whoever it is at the throne room, you throw down your P-59, you slide over this guy, let's say. So you really need the throne room backed up. You really want to make sure that your Naboo system is doing well. For instance, you've got your DFS fighter there, you've got the cannons on them as well, and you've got a couple interrupts in hand in case they come down. And now you're looking strong, your objective flips. Remember, the icons are now back at Naboo, so your opponent can deploy straight there. They can come straight at you. And you can't really evade, because if you evade from Naboo, now it flips back, because you need to maintain presence at the system and the throne room to maintain the 7 side. And then you get all the fun stuff where you're now drawing to Battle Destiny. Your opponent, if they're drawing an interrupt for Battle Destiny, is losing it. So lots of cool stuff is happening. So it is like worthwhile to maintain the 7 if you can. But yeah, just remember that you can't really evade from Naboo if that happens. Although I guess I should flag, it's not the worst move in the world, because if you run away from Naboo and you flip back to the 0 side, you've now run away to a battleground site, and your opponent is now on a non-battleground site because they've lost the icons there. So you might actually get in a situation by running away from Naboo, even though you flip, you now don't have to pay to drain, and your opponent does have to pay to drain. So that's something to remember about evading. You lose the 7, but it might help you in certain ways as well. And that's it. Now you just want to do what you need to do to maintain these sites if you want to stay. So keep your Stronghold up here and throw your other characters and other battle droids elsewhere to drain or to clear your opponent off other sites. So ideally, you're draining at these two or battling at these two and draining and battling elsewhere.
I mean, I think the cumulative damage you can do in the first like 3 or 4 turns can almost also be crippling, because you can, drain for 2, you're getting ping for 1. Like, you can have like maybe 15 force lost in the first like 3 or 4 turns to your opponent, right? Like,
yeah,
hard to come back. Like, why do I only have 23 cards in my reserve deck?
This deck can get very dangerous quickly, right? You threaten the drains, you threaten the pings, just a few turns of that, especially if you're not paying to drain. Just a few turns where you can do that without having to pay is really nice. If you're on your flip side, remember, your destinies are so high. So not only are your weapons clearing characters and their forfeits -4, but you're drawing 5s and 6s for destiny. If you're on the flip side, or you've got OWO and you're drawing 2 destiny, think about a battle where you shoot 2 guys with guns and you hit 1 or both of them and you draw 2 destiny at 5 or 6, and now you've drawn like 10 or 12 battle destiny. They have to lose a lot to attrition. They've got characters that they have to lose that are forfeiting for -4 each. So you can clear sites and potentially overflow your opponent pretty well on this deck, with the flip certainly, but even potentially without the flip.
We touched on this a little bit, but let's close out. What are some bad matchups for this deck?
Yeah, I'd say, bad matchups, even though you can potentially hit Jedi or high destiny, high ability characters, mains, Jedi, lightsabers are just really tough for this deck. You get like, you get your Obis and your Quiggies and your Lukes and, and your Anakins and so on and so forth. And they've got lightsabers on them, and they can really clear your sight. They have a lot of interrupts that can be very dangerous for you, which I should have put on the slides, but sorry about the mess. Which if they hit you, makes you go lost immediately. Clash of Sabers can exclude you from battle before a battle, or potentially make your character go lost if they've hit you and then exclude you. So if they're swinging and they're making your forfeit 0 and they're getting rid of characters and they've got a ton of power, it can be very hard to hit them. That's a tough matchup. Heavy space can be tough as well. I think this deck does better, can evade, but heavy space, eventually you're gonna lose your space package. You might surprise them early and maybe they can't come back from it, but generally speaking, you just want to try to last as long as you can in space against a heavy space deck to get a bunch of free drains in, before you have to start paying. I think those are kind of like the biggest trouble for this deck.
Well, great. So that is Invasion.
Yeah, and so I by the way, we didn't do a late game thing, but they're again like mid game but later, which is to say, I don't really know of much of a different strategy in the late game. Just keep doing those same things that you were doing in the mid game, I think, for the most part.
Well, I'd love to hear people's questions, thoughts on this deck. If you have recommendations or questions about decks you'd like to see in the future, I think we're going to do a few more of these with some B cards. But we've gotten really positive feedback on Greg's first video, so hopefully we continue that trend, so we don't scare him away. But any kind of final thoughts here, Greg?
No, I mean, I hope this is helpful. People are welcome to reach out to me. I'm not a top tier player by any means, but I at least know the decks that I play very well. So if folks have questions, happy to help. Yeah, I think this is super fun. It'll be annoying for your opponent. I don't think it's an NPE experience. Hopefully your opponent doesn't either, because it's at least a lot of battling. It's not like the kind of deck where you're off doing your own thing, avoiding battles and just like draining, or you got some, like there's a lot of fighting that goes on in this deck, and I think that's always fun to do. So
yeah, I agree. It's a very interactive deck, or if your opponent doesn't interact, they will lose in like 4 turns.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, you really pressure them to interact with you.
Yeah. Well, that's all the time we have. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. Like, subscribe, all that good stuff, and we will be back with some more deck videos in the future.